I never meant to find out. That night, I was just cleaning the house. Nothing unusual. But when I opened the drawer in his room, I discovered something that made my hands tremble. It wasn't just a secret. It was a betrayal. A lie that had been growing under our roof for months. I sat there for hours, unable to breathe, unable to process what I had seen. I raised him like my own. Gave him everything. And yet, this is how he repaid me? You think you know someone, until their truth punches you in the chest that I never imagined love would arrive in the form of a second chance. Not in the traditional sense, flowers, candlelight and stolen glances, but in the quiet corridors of a house that didn't quite feel like mine, and in the silent eyes of a boy who refused to look at me. After marrying Faison, a gentle man with kind habits and a sadness in his smile, I moved into his family home. A peaceful house surrounded by tall poplar trees and a garden that hadn't been touched in years. He had lost his first wife to illness, and I respected the delicate space she had left behind. But it was Ayan, his 17-year-old son, who made me feel like a stranger in my own life. Ayan wasn't rude. He was polite, even cordial, but there was a wall so tall between us, I couldn't even see over it. Our conversations rarely moved past "good morning" and "thank you for dinner." He spent most of his time in his room, the door always slightly ajar but never welcoming. I noticed how he avoided eye contact, how he disappeared into his sketchbooks, always drawing but never sharing. I tried not to force anything. I believed in time, in patience, in silence being its own kind of communication. But still it hurt. Every meal where he excused himself early, every birthday I tried to make special that he shrugged off, it all left a mark. I didn't want to be his mother. I only wanted to be someone he didn't need to guard himself against. One ordinary afternoon, I decided to clean the upstairs hallway closet, the one with loose hinges and old winter coats. A few boxes were stacked carelessly inside, textbooks, faded photographs, and one leather-bound notebook tied with string. It wasn't hidden, but it felt private. I hesitated. Then I sat down on the floor and untied it. Inside were pages filled with sketches and handwritten letters, raw, poetic, and full of emotion. They spoke to someone named Sarah. The first letter started mid-thought, as if the writer had been talking to her for years. Asterisk. You said if I could draw your laugh, I'd never be lonely again. I tried. It's still not right. Asterisk. Each page carried the weight of a heart that had loved deeply and lost quietly. The sketches weren't perfect. Some were just outlines, others smudged, but they held something rare, truth. Sarah's eyes, her braid, her smile. They repeated again and again, as if he was afraid to forget them. In one letter he wrote, asterisk, I walk past the bench every day. Your absence sits heavier than your presence ever did. Asterisk. That one stayed with me. I closed the book gently, almost with guilt, but also with a strange sense of closeness. This wasn't something he ever meant for anyone to find. But now that I had, I couldn't unfeel what I felt. It wasn't just young love. It was pain bottled and shelved, quietly shaping a boy into someone who avoided laughter and resisted comfort. I didn't mention the notebook. Not that day, not the next. But I began to see Ayan differently. Not as someone who rejected me, but as someone protecting the one piece of himself that still felt whole. I started to adjust, not in big ways, but with quiet care. I added a small sketchpad beside his breakfast plate one morning, pretending it had been lying around. I picked up a book of poetry and left it near the staircase. He never said a word, but I noticed him pick it up. That evening, while watering the garden, I decided to plant something new. Ayan had once written that Sarah loved white lilies. I didn't know if he'd notice, but it felt right. Maybe this house needed blooming again. Love doesn't always arrive as romance. Sometimes it comes wrapped in silence, in loss, in notebooks no one was meant to find. But I had found it. And something told me it had found me too. The next morning, I waited until the house was quiet and opened the notebook again. This time, I read slower, letting every word settle. The letters weren't written like diary entries. They were conversations, unfinished, hopeful, and aching. He wrote to her as if she might read them one day. Or maybe as if writing them was the only way to keep her near. Asterisk. You once said silence makes the loudest memories. I hear you everywhere. Asterisk. Each letter peeled back another layer of Ayan I'd never seen. He hadn't just lost a girl. He had lost a version of himself. The boy in those letters was alive with color. He was curious, vulnerable, even funny. One letter described how they'd skipped class to sit by the canal and feed ducks stale bread, laughing at their own rebellion like it meant something profound. Sarah was more than a name. She was a presence in those pages. She encouraged him to draw, to write, to believe in his talent when no one else noticed it. There was one sketch of her holding a sunflower, half-finished. Next to it, he had written, asterisk, "You never got to see this one. It was supposed to be a gift." Asterisk. The last few entries shifted in tone. There was urgency in the words, a storm building. Sarah's father had received a transfer. Her family had to move cities. Suddenly, and without the time or space to say goodbye properly. Ayan had stayed at the station that morning, waiting, hoping she'd come to say something. She didn't. She left a note with a neighbor, which he found 2 days later. It simply said, asterisk, "Don't stop drawing. You're more alive when you do." Asterisk. After that, the letters changed. They became shorter, more fragmented. The sketches darker. One simply read, asterisk, "I don't know who I am without your voice echoing in my mind." Asterisk. That was when I understood the silence he carried. It wasn't coldness. It was grief, unacknowledged, unprocessed. And worse, it was dismissed by everyone around him as teenage drama, something he'd eventually outgrow. But he hadn't. He had built a room around his sorrow and lived inside it. I placed the notebook back exactly as I found it. Nothing about it felt like mine to hold, even if it had already changed the way I saw him. That afternoon, I noticed him watching me while I trimmed the plants. His eyes paused on the white lilies I had planted days before. He looked away quickly, but I saw it, the flicker of recognition. And something softer, something like confusion, maybe even curiosity. I didn't push. I didn't hint. I simply carried on, leaving room for silence to work its own way. That night, I left a note under his sketchpad. Asterisk, "Art survives even when we don't speak. Thank you for sharing yours." Asterisk. The next morning the note was gone. Nothing was said. But at breakfast he didn't leave early. He stayed, ate quietly and looked up once, just briefly, then back down. No smile, no words. But in that brief glance, something had shifted. A bridge had begun to build. The love Ayan had felt wasn't some forgotten teenage fling. It had shaped his world. And though Sarah was gone, her imprint remained in his every line, his every pause. It was buried deep, yes, but not dead. He had simply hidden it where no one could touch it. Until now. And without knowing how, or why, I had become a part of that story. Not to replace anyone. Just to witness it. To let it breathe again. And maybe, slowly, to help him believe that not all love stories end in silence. He didn't ask how I found the notebook. He just walked into the kitchen one afternoon, picked up a glass of water, and without looking at me said, "Did you read them?" There was no accusation in his voice, just weariness, maybe a bit of fear. I nodded. I did. He sat down. No dramatic pause, no build-up. Just sat, like the weight of keeping it in had finally worn him down. She was the only person who saw me. Not just the version I showed people. The real me. It was easy to be honest with her. I listened. I didn't offer comfort or advice. I knew better. He didn't want sympathy. He just needed his truth to exist somewhere outside that notebook. She told me to draw. Said I had something in my hands that couldn't be taught. I stopped after she left. It felt pointless. He paused, then added, "But those lilies you planted, she loved them. I used to draw them in the corners of her notebooks." That was the first real thread between us. Not forced, not created out of duty, just something shared. The days after that felt different. Ayan still kept to himself, but there was a softness in the silence now. He lingered longer in rooms, responded with more than one-word answers. I left a new set of pencils on the table one morning. They were gone by afternoon. He didn't talk much, but he started drawing again. I'd catch glimpses, hands, eyes, unfinished outlines of a face he hadn't forgotten. One day, a folded paper appeared beside my cup of tea. Inside was a sketch of the kitchen. with me pouring tea and Ayan sitting at the table. No faces, just outlines. But the detail in the hands, the warmth in the lines, it said everything. We didn't talk about Sarah again. Not directly. But I noticed him rereading the letters. He started carrying the notebook again, not to hide it, but as if it finally belonged to the present. One weekend, I mentioned a local youth art exhibition. No pressure, I said. Just something to think about. He didn't respond. But a week later, he quietly asked for the submission deadline. He worked late into the nights. The door stayed closed, but not shut. When I passed by, I heard pencil strokes, faint music, sometimes the creak of him adjusting his chair. The house felt alive in a new way, like it was healing. The morning of the exhibition, he showed me a piece. His final one. It was a portrait of a girl, half laughing, eyes full of sunlight. At the bottom he'd written, asterisk, you never left. You became the reason I stayed. Asterisk. He didn't need approval. He just needed someone to witness it. I said, it's beautiful. He nodded once, no smile, but his eyes didn't look away. That evening, before leaving for the event, he stopped at the garden. He crouched near the lilies, touched a blooming one lightly, and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then he stood, straightened his shoulders, and walked to the door. I didn't follow right away. I stayed back for a moment, letting the quiet speak. That's when I realized something. This wasn't about moving on from love. It was about honoring it. About letting it grow roots somewhere safe. Entrusting me with his silence, Ayan had taken his first step forward. And in accepting it without condition, I had found my place, not as a replacement, not as a savior, but simply as someone who stayed. The night of the exhibition arrived with a quiet hum of anticipation. The room was softly lit, warm amber tones reflecting off the walls lined with paintings and sketches from young artists across the town. I stood by the entrance, watching faces, some nervous, some proud, while waiting for Ayan. When he appeared, there was a shift in the air. His posture was steadier, eyes clearer. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was someone who had carried his past with him, and was finally ready to share it. His artwork hung in the center, drawing the attention of the crowd. The portrait of Sarah was impossible to miss, radiant, full of life, as if she might step off the canvas any second. People whispered admiration, moved by the depth and emotion captured in the strokes. Suddenly, a girl entered with her parents, her eyes searching. When they landed on the portrait, something changed. She looked around, then met Ayan's gaze. The recognition was immediate. It was Sarah. There was no dramatic reunion, no tears or rushed words. Just two people who had carried the weight of time and distance finally standing face to face. Ayan's lips curled into a small smile, a quiet relief washing over his features. Sarah smiled back, warm and steady, as if this moment had been waiting to happen all along. They talked softly, sharing memories, updates, laughter. Their conversation was gentle, full of the unspoken understanding that some connections never truly break, no matter how far apart life takes you. I watched from a distance, feeling a swell of something indescribable, joy, hope, the kind of love that doesn't demand perfection but simply presence. Later, as the event ended, Ayan and Sarah stepped outside. The evening breeze was cool, carrying the scent of blooming lilies from the garden. He turned to me and said, "Thank you for everything. For finding the pieces I lost." I smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. Sometimes love waits for us to find it again. The house felt different when we returned, lighter, open. Ayan and I worked together in the garden the next morning, planting new lilies. He was quieter than before but more at peace. As if the secret he once tried to bury was now a seed growing strong. I realized then that love isn't just about beginnings or endings. It's about showing up, being patient, holding space for healing, and most importantly, believing that even the most hidden stories deserve to be told. Our story was never about replacing the past but about honoring it and finding new paths forward. Paths paved with trust, understanding, and quiet courage. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light across the garden, I knew this was just the beginning of a love that was true, resilient, and beautifully unexpected.